Hello everyone, we're back again with another episode of The Fact, the series that discusses international issues every week. We have three respected guests today, and we would like to talk about the subject of recent attacks by Turkey to northern parts of Syria. And we have today with us three respected guests. We have Reverend Dr. Andrew Ashdown. He is an academic and regular visitor to Middle East. And we also have Mr. Patrick Henningsen. He is also a political activist and analyst from UK. And also we have Mr. Iyad Khuder. He is a Syrian former journalist, and he's with us in this program from Czech Republic. I would like to welcome all three of you to the program. It's a great honor to have you on this episode of The Fact. I would like to start with Dr. Ashdown about the first question, which is the one of the main questions of this program. If you want to give us an explanation about the reason behind this attack by Turkey government toward northern parts of Syria, which is basically a Kurdish area of Syria, what would be the reasons and what would be the justifications or explanation behind it?
First of all, I think it's important to say that of course, they're attacking Syria, which is part of Syria. And when we talk about a Kurdish area of Syria, we're talking about northeast Syria, where the Kurds are perhaps about 30% of that area. So when we talk about northeast Syria and we talk about the Kurdish part of Syria, they are part of the population in that area of Syria, along with other Arabs and, of course, a very significant Christian minority group as well. Now, historically speaking, for decades, the Turkish governments have been fighting against or if you like, oppressing the Kurdish groups within Turkey. The majority of Kurds live in Turkey. Most of the Kurds in the Syrian part of the region actually come from Turkey. Most of them were refugees from Turkey in the 1930s, 1920s, although there were Kurds in that area. And the primary role, I think, of what the Turkish are trying to do now in this attack, which is attack against the Syrian state, is to, what they see is to put a barrier between themselves and what they perceive to be Kurdish terrorists living and operating within Syria. It does appear to a certain extent in their plans of putting a safe zone where they want to put a couple of million refugees in that safe zone. These would be refugees who are sympathetic to Turkey, and it would be a demographic change of that area as well. So it'd be a buffer zone, if you like, between Turkey and the area where the Kurds reside in northeast Syria. But it would also be a demographic change of that area. And one has to ask, to what extent is this trying to make facts on the ground, or perhaps a future change of borders? I don't know. That's just a question that perhaps lies open for the future. But in any case, this is an attack against a sovereign country, and without permission, of course, from the Syrian government. They're out of the question. And to what extent has this been permitted, if you like, by other nations for this to be allowed to go ahead? But that role primary, from the Turkish point of view, would be to attack the Kurdish groups, which they perceive to be terrorist entities, a threat to Turkey, which have been for many.
Thank you, Dr. Ashdown. Here, I would like to know about I can say the seas of support from USA toward the Kurdish people, because as you all know, in recent years, USA tried to support Kurdish groups in different sections and in different occasions. And but today, when we see the issue of attack of Turkey, we don't see any kind of support from USA toward Kurdish people. So, Patrick, what is
a shift in policy from Washington, at least on the surface. But I think it's important to take a broader view of recent events and put them in a broader context. And when you do that, you can see that it's very possible that Washington has temporarily abandoned the Syrian-Kurdish factions or the Syrian Democratic Forces, which aren't all Kurdish. By the way, there probably is about 2/3 Kurdish membership, and the rest will be a coalition of Arab militias. And also, I might add, the SDF comprise of some former ISIS fighters as well, and other militants. I just thought I'd insert that there because I think it's important to show that the Syrian Democratic Forces are not democratic, and they're not all Kurdish either. But that said, the Kurdish factions in Syria have been useful to the United States. It's given them an excuse to be able to occupy northeastern Syria, even not physically occupying the whole territory, but being able to occupy key parts of this region. One of the important parts of this was to make sure that Syria's oil and gas fields would be continuously occupied. Previous to the SDF in the United States taking over that occupation, essentially squatting Syria's natural resources, ISIS was performing that duty. So you can see the seamless handover, in a way, from ISIS to the SDF in the United States. What does that mean? That's part of a broader strategy of economic warfare that the United States is waging against Damascus. You have to understand that, put that into context with economic sanctions, punitive sanctions, a full economic embargo, in fact, of Syria by the U.S. and the EU and the European Union. So you have a situation where Damascus cannot readily purchase fuel, affordable fuel, good quality fuel, and it doesn't have control of its own resources. It's having to buy some on the black market from this region in Syria through various intermediaries, or wait for potential rescue from a country like Iran, as we saw a couple of months ago, and that tanker was apprehended by the British at the orders, probably most likely of Washington. So that's why the Kurds in this case were useful to the U.S. The other reason is the broader long-range goal is to weaken Syria. You do this by breaking up Syria, making sure that Syria is not united, physically detaching parts of it in much the same way the United States did with Iraqi Kurdistan in the First and Second Gulf War. That was a great victory for the U.S. in weakening the Arab Republic of Iraq. And so this is a repeat of that operation in Syria. Although the conditions are different, although the country is different, it's the same sort of technique that the United States has done. So that also serves the interests of U.S. allies in the region, namely Israel and also Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And this continues along a long-range policy that goes right back into the Cold War of suppressing any viable Arab nationalist governments and Arab nationalism in general. So if you look at it in this way, it does suit the interest of Israel to weaken its neighbor Syria. It's less of a threat. It's less able to come to the aid of countries like Lebanon, for instance, or Iraq, for that matter, or any of the other Arab countries that are under threat by the U.S. or its allies, economically strangling the country as well. So the Kurdish factions in Syria have performed this for the United States and its allies. And so there is a slight problem in that Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States. They're within the NATO alliance. So these agendas are rubbing a little bit. There's friction between Washington and the U.S. on the Kurdish. I think this is a temporary situation. They could very well come back to woo them once again in the future. And I'm not talking about next month or next year. If you look at the gap between the first and the second Gulf Wars, there was no regime change in the first Gulf War. They waited 12 years. They ground down the Iraqi Republic with sanctions. They weakened it. They divided it. They dismembered it. And then they came in and crushed it in 2003. This is what the U.S. and its coalition have done. So in terms of that long-range policy, that U.S. and Israel, their shared goals in the region, it's quite possible that they could be leaving now, but to come back in the future, because they have demonstrated that they can buy the loyalty of Kurdish militants in Syria, that they're not loyal to Damascus if offered the right terms, the money, arms, status, some infrastructure, and so forth. And also the Kurdish faction saw that as protection against Turkey, against Turkish aggression. So the United States is quite adept at playing off various parties against each other in much the same way the British are highly skilled. During their imperial days, the U.S. has learned a few tricks from the British Empire in that respect. But so it's quite possible that this support will remain, although it's not direct support now. Certainly, they may have political support in Washington for forever, as long as they're useful in this respect to Washington and its allies.
Right now we have these kind of intentions and also negotiations in order to make some cooperation between Syrian government and Kurdish people, and I would like to know if it will eventually affect the situation in a positive way, or it won't be effective if we want to look at the long term. So what would be the explanation behind that?
Syria is made up of so many communal groups. And I wonder if he's trying to say that if one speaks specifically of the Kurds and tries to treat them specially, as opposed to any of the other multiple communal groups that exist in Syria and have coexisted for centuries, whether that sort of separates them out and gives them special status, as it were. Remembering as well that, as I said, in the northeast of Syria, the Kurds are about 30% of the northeast and about 10% of the whole of Syria. And as he's rightly said, that there are Kurds all over Syria as well, in small numbers, and in the government and so forth. But yes, the most sensible thing the Kurds could have done, and they probably should have done quite a long time ago, is liaise with the Syrian government to maintain the stability of Syria as a whole. And it's been unwise of them not to do so. And of course, the Kurds are divided in themselves. That's another fact. There are those who have wanted to liaise with the Syrian government, be part of the Syrian system, and those that don't, and that's part of the problem. But the fact that they have come to an agreement is positive. We wait to see how that actually works out in the medium to longer term. And whether that can be sustained. One hopes that it can be, and I really hope that both the Syrian government and representatives of the Kurdish communities can liaise to work out how, under the Syrian system, under the Syrian government, the system can operate throughout northeast Syria and, of course, throughout Syria. So coming under the umbrella of the Syrian government. That is the safest way for the Kurds and for the most secure way for Syria as a whole. One really hopes that can happen. So it's a positive move, but it's going to be a difficult one, given that there are Kurdish people who feel very differently, and there'll be quite a negotiation to do in terms of how that is managed. But let's not forget that there are other communities in northeast Syria that also support the Syrian government, and all the communities need to be considered in any agreements that are being undertaken. And most of all, it's Syrians who need to work this out. A very clever thing, and when they talk about Turkish mercenaries attacking Kurdish, the SDF and so forth, and they've been pretty brutal. These Turkish mercenaries that are suddenly labelled as if they've come out of the blue are, of course, the multiple extremist so-called rebel groups that the Western governments have been supporting for all these 9 years. They are a coalition, including what the West calls moderates, who are part of the Turkish attack on northeast Syria and committing brutal crimes. I just wanted to make that point that they're part of the picture as well. They're still there, very much engaged and very much involved. And although the West says that it's against the Turkish attacks, at the same time we're supporting these multiple militant extremist factions that are part of that attack.
Possible consensus toward or possible gatherings against Turkey, because recently we have seen all different moves by Turkey government in order to intervene in Syria situation, and in the efforts of this country. I would like to know, eventually, would it would cause any kind of conflict against Turkey by other countries or not? So, Patrick, what is your opinion about this issue?
How does Turkey's present moves, how does this play out in terms of the global court of public opinion? And I think you have to look at the current government in Turkey that's fighting on two fronts. It's trying to enact a gradual transformation of Turkish society internally, but it's also trying to develop a metamorphosis of Turkey as a more important and more prominent regional actor and global actor as well. Internally, Turkey is in the process of transforming from a Kemalist, centric, more secular state apparatus into more of an Islamist state or society. And this has been spearheaded by President Erdogan's AKP party. This is front and center in their domestic agenda. And unfortunately, proving this to his base, we use the term his base, his political base, which is a popular term now made popular in the United States with President Trump or with right-wing political governments and leaders. Erdogan's playing to his base, so what he does in Syria to the south of the border is very important. He is absolutely playing on historic themes along religious lines and along sectarian lines too, because the overwhelming character of the new Turkey is definitely a Sunni Turkey. So you could see some scholars use this term Sunnification of the new Turkey. That's absolutely part of this agenda of Erdogan. And this then plays out regionally, internationally in a kind of what people might call a crude term, neo-Ottomanism, or a reviving of Turkey's status as a major political actor and also as a religious leader, as a spiritual political leader or political Islamic leader in the Middle East. Certainly it's looking to advance up the pecking order, as it were, up to the level maybe where Saudi Arabia sees itself as a custodial power in the Islamic world. Turkey also has extended its reach to Africa as well. They're much more active in places like Sudan and other parts of North Africa, etc. So clearly wanting to expand its influence in this way. So it does risk the backlash in the short term, in the sense that it's now on the sort of the radar of the Western human rights market of outrage, basically. In much the same way, Saudi Arabia is now very much on that map after the Khashoggi incident. It was unheard of that U.S. politicians would take shots at Saudi royal family members on the floor of Congress or Senate, and now it's commonplace. So that was unheard of 10 or 20 years ago. And now it happens regularly. And that's because of this and also the Yemen conflict as well. It's opened up more interest in what Saudi's doing in Yemen. And in the same way, Turkey is now on that radar in the West, being a target of people's righteous indignation as a result of this recent incursion in Syria. But I'm going to remind people that it's not the first time Turkey has invaded Syria. It's the third time in as many years that they have launched operations inside Syria. So it should come to no surprise. The only difference is that the press and some political leaders are paying attention now, partly because it's attached to Donald Trump in the U.S. withdrawal of troops. Otherwise, the media hardly even lifted a finger to point at Turkey during Operation Euphrates Shield or Operation Olive Branch. These are acts of aggression against a neighboring country, quite clearly. Like Dr. Ashdown said, changing facts on the ground. This is absolutely what Turkey is trying to do in Afrin. It's what it's trying to do in Jarbalus, in Manbij, in many places along the border region. And so will the global community or consensus catch up to Turkey that deeply, looking really deeply at what its agenda is domestically and regionally? I don't think so. I don't think anybody in the West really understands what's really going on with Turkey unless they follow the Turkish press or translate Turkish media reports and see what commentators have been saying there for the last 3 or 4 years as this agenda has really been ramped up. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that Syria has become the unfortunate recipient of what is largely a transformation inside Turkey, and I think its support of the Free Syrian Army, of some of the jihadist factions, in a very cynical way. I think the Erdogan AKP-led government has used these vanguard shock troops to clear the way to possibly transform the demographics along its border regions. But Erdogan has made no secret of, in public speeches, saying that Aleppo belongs to Turkey. That they would take Aleppo one day. I mean, you go look at some of his public statements over the last 5 years or 10 years. It's unbelievable, the stuff that you hear. And if that was in English, and if that was President Trump saying that, for instance, it would reverberate across the globe as a big scandal because it happens in Turkey and it's Erdogan saying it. He's been saying these things for years, and nobody has said anything to object to any of this rhetoric. And it is playing out in terms of facts on the ground. Absolutely. And so I don't think the international press or political actors in the U.S. have any idea to that level. Maybe the intelligence services do. Maybe the CIA understands this, but they know the public will not get wind of it.
So, Iyad, in here I would like to know about the role of Iran in this whole conflict. And if you want to give us some kind of, explanation about the possible duties and role of Iran in this conflict between Syria and Turkey, what would you say?
Well, I think Iran could be helpful in diplomatic efforts and in intermediating between Syria and Turkey, because Iran is maintaining good relations with both sides, with both countries. So I think this would be very helpful to make a channel of dialogue between the two sides to at least to lose the tension. However, if you don't mind, to go back to the reasons behind the Turkish attack on Syria, if you have time for that. First of all, I would like to tell you that the problem is not between Syria and the Kurds, because you used the term like Syrian government and Kurdish people, and this is not accurate because there are many Kurds in Syria, in the government control areas. Personally, I was raised in a quarter in Damascus where there are many Kurdish families. We used to live. I didn't even know that they are Kurdish just when I visited them at home, and I listened to some Kurdish songs. So it's not a problem between Kurds and Arabs. The problem is with the YPG authorities who are seeking separation, and I think no one nation will be okay to that. Look at Catalonia, for example. In general, Spanish people are not happy if a part of their country split. No one nation, I think, will be happy if their country splits, especially if this is supported by other nations. So this is first, that it's not about a conflict between Kurds and Arabs. Second, I would like to tell you about the reasons and motivations behind this attack by Turkey. Although this is true that Turkey is interested in deterring the YPG and PKK from its border, and this is true, this is understandable, but this claim seems to be suspicious to me. I doubt that this is the main motivation. So let's classify Turkish reasons behind this operation in three parts. There is the direct reason, which is used as a pretext, which is the PKK threat. Okay, this can be true, but it's just a pretext. But there is another strategic reason, which is declared actually by Turkey also. They say they want to provide a territory for Syrian refugees. They give it a human aspect. They are caring about these refugees. And I think here, in Syria, most of Syrians know that Turkish government, EKP, I think, what's the name of their Justice and Development Party of Erdogan, actually they bear a big portion of responsibility of the war in Syria. So this is first. But I think actually I believe Turkish government that they want to move these refugees because it's become a burden. And what they mean by refugees, actually they mean the deported terrorists and their families. So they have become a burden on Turkey. Many of the terrorist and extremist organizations such as Islam Army, which was supported by Saudi Arabia, and Jaish al-Rahman, which is supported by Turkey. They have been deported. Most of them, most of the leaders are in Turkey, and they have become a burden on them. So they want to get rid of them. So they want to put them to find a place inside Syria for them. So it's not like a noble motivation. Third, this is the covert motivation that they never say. It is as the guest mentioned, the neo-Ottomanism. By the way, there are a lot of statements and ideas that have been said by their think tanks, like Ahmed Davutoglu. He wrote a book that is called Strategic Depths, like the English translation of his book, and he wrote it back in 2001, as I think, or 2003, in which he talked about the Turkish strategic depth in Syria, in Iraq, and other regions. So they believe that these areas, they belong to the like Ottoman umbrella. So this is in very brief. Like I don't want to like elaborate too long with my answer, but this is briefly.
Thank you, Iyad. That was a very interesting explanation. I would like to give each one of you, because the program is almost out of time, but I would like to give like 1 or 2 minutes in case each one of you want to add anything to the subject. So I will start with Dr. Ashdown. So if you want to add anything about the subject, please go ahead.
You mentioned about the role of Iran, and I think that actually when you look at the wider geopolitical issues, and yes, as Patrick Henningsen pointed out, I think that Iran represents an important counterbalance geopolitically with the whole, you've got the Saudi, Israel, America, European axis, as it were, and that's you then get into the Sunni Shia issue, and I think that Iran has a very, very important geopolitical counterbalance in Syria during the war, because I think that actually, well, I know that particularly the Hezbollah were key in protecting particularly the Christian towns and villages in the Kalamun during the war, and I was there, and they protected the monasteries and the villages and towns along with the Syrian army and along with the Sunni and Shia communities as well. So I think that's important to recognise, that Iran has played an important role in protecting Syria from outside interventions, aggressive interventions. And continues to play an important strategic role in the region. Potentially dangerous external, the powers of influence, if you like, of Saudi, particularly the Saudi influence in the region, and Israel, of course, as well.
Thank you, Doctor. So, Patrick, please go ahead.
Regarding recent events in northeastern Syria, is that the desire by the Turkish government, or the proposal which they agreed with the United States recently in what was a type of a ceasefire agreement or a pause, Turkey has made it very clear it wants to establish a safe zone. And I think people should be reminded this is the exact same plan that was put forward by Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and by successive U.S. Secretary of States and U.S. presidents as well, Barack Obama, namely. So this idea of a safe zone, this poses a direct threat to Damascus for a number of reasons. The reason the U.S. wanted to establish a safe zone to begin with, I'm talking 5 and 6 years ago, when they first started floating this idea. It's to establish a anti-Damascus enclave. It's a launching pad for extremism. It's a guarantee of instability in this region. And when you have instability, this guarantees the involvement of the United States as a mediator. Okay, so they're trying to create the conditions that will guarantee that they will have their hand in affairs and be, like I said before, being able to play groups off against each other, and to steer how things are going in a certain direction that they want to steer in. And they have an absolute advantage in doing that because they have a full partner to the south in Israel. They have the compliance of Jordan to a large degree. They could easily patch up their differences with Turkey. They are also NATO members. So it's very dangerous to allow this Turkish-administered safe zone, because it's exactly what the U.S. Wanted for so long. And I don't see the U.S. objecting to this at all, even though it clearly will destabilize the region for years to come. And if stability was the real objective of Washington and stamping out the terrorist threat, it would not be supporting a Turkish safe zone in northern Syria, because it's going to be a breeding ground for terrorism. Turkey's record is very bad in supporting terrorism in Syria over the last 8 years, and the U.S. has an abysmal record as well. You put those two conditions together, they will continue to have these fights with the Kurdish population. It will only embolden Kurdish militants even more, because they will feel under threat as well. So it's a recipe for disaster. What is going on with trying to establish this so-called safe zone. If they want stability, it should be under the control and administration of the Syrian government and its partners, namely Russia and Iran, who have proven that they can create ceasefires and create stability in thousands of locations, hundreds of locations, around the country, which they've done very effectively over the last 4 years. So that's something I'd be very, very worried about if this safe zone plan goes forward. It's something to think about.
Let me say it ironically that we Syrians would like to thank Mr. Trump for treating very badly their partners, here referring to the YPG, that because of that YPG had no option other than returning to their homeland, Syria. And of course, Syria is like a mother, and they will be always welcome to come back. And by the way, as Syrian people, we all hope that in the new constitution, Kurdish people will have their full rights, in terms of language. Just to say that YPG leaders, they exaggerate too much. They always present themselves as victims by everybody. But let me say, even I read, for example, they tell Westerners that they are not allowed to get any employment at the government, which is untrue. Let's take an example. I know personally a lady who is one of the colleagues of Dr. Al-Jafari in New York. Her name is Avin Durkee, and she's Kurdish. My supervisor at work, I worked for the government, was Kurdish. This is to say, but I mean, in terms of language, I completely declare my support to their right in learning in Kurdish. So why not considering Kurdish as a second official language? Why not? So this is what I want to say as Syrian, and I think the Syrian government is open to that. They declared that everything is on the table. I would also like to say that the so-called buffer zone, this project, is not new. Let's not forget that there was another operation called Olive Branch. You see romantic names, Olive Branch, Spring of Peace. So this was in March 2018 when they took Afrin, which is part of Idlib. By the way, let me tell you that I personally made a TV report in 2015 about the buffer zone, about this term. They had this map of the buffer zone even at that time. And if you go back, you find articles about buffer zone. This term floated in the media since 2012. So they have been working on that since that time. I think this is a kind of expansionism, if I say it correctly, and it is neo-Ottomanism, and it expresses the real fascist regime of Erdogan.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your brilliant and fruitful explanations and answers. I would like to add something in here very shortly, but it is very important. As you might know, recently our website has been under so much cyber attacks by different servers from Saudi Arabia and United States and Israel, and it is interesting to know that even a website which is basically just a website came from few young people who are being a part of Iranian population, even these websites are being attacked by foreign servers and foreign hackers, and it shows how much this foreign countries or foreign entities like Israel and Saudi Arabia are afraid of such discussions. So I would like to thank all three of you, Dr. Ashdown, Mr. Henningsen, and Mr. Khuder, for your time and for your contributions to this program. Hereby, I would like to invite everyone also to follow and check our website and social network pages on Facebook and Twitter and different social networks, which is most of them are unfortunately down because of these attacks, but still we're trying our best to continue this media movement. And so hereby I would like to say goodbye and thank you everyone.